"That son of a bitch got me twice." That is what a father said, a real father, about the man who took his 14-year-old daughter, once when he killed her, and the second time, when that father never got the chance to look him in the eye. Every word of this story leads back to that sentence. But to understand it, we start on the morning of June 1st, 1989. Las Vegas, Nevada, a city of bright lights surrounded by a darkness that goes on for miles. And that morning, somewhere inside all that darkness, something was waiting. Her name was Stephanie Isaacson. Her father, John, was a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force. The job meant movement, new bases, new cities, new schools. Most kids fall apart under that pressure. Stephanie did the opposite. Every new place, she walked in and made it hers. But through every move, every new city, the one thing that never changed was her and her father. They did not just live in the same house, they built a life together. Horses on weekends, motorcycles on open roads, camping, hunting, boating. At Lake Mead, the two of them went underwater together and earned their scuba diving certifications side by side, a father and his teenage daughter, exploring a world most people never bother to see. When John and Stephanie's mother separated, there was no long conversation about where she would go. She chose her father. Her younger sister Joanne, just 5 years old, stayed with their mother Sharon. But Stephanie made sure that distance never became disconnection. The girls shared every Wednesday, every weekend, every holiday. That bond was something Stephanie protected. One afternoon, her friends planned a mall trip. Stephanie was ready to go, but she had one condition. Joanne had to come. Her friends said no. Stephanie's answer came without a pause. "If Joan doesn't go, I don't go." She stayed home. No argument, no drama, just a quiet decision that said more about her character than any description ever could. At 14, she already understood something most adults forget, that loyalty is not a feeling. It is a choice you make even when it costs you something. By spring of 1989, Stephanie was finishing her year at El Dorado High School. She sang in the choir, and that room had become something sacred to her small circle of friends. Every day at lunch, the same group gathered in their choir teacher Jocelyn Jensen's classroom. Not the cafeteria, not the hallways, Jensen's room, because it was theirs. They ate together, talked, laughed in the same corner every single day. They called themselves the Little Team. 6 weeks from that June morning, Stephanie was supposed to be on a plane to Spain. Her father had new orders, a new country, a new chapter. Everything she knew in Las Vegas was about to be left behind. She never got the chance to say goodbye to any of it. June 1st, 1989 arrived the way Las Vegas summer mornings do. Still, already warm before the sun had fully risen. The kind of quiet that sits heavy on the desert before the heat takes over. John had worked the overnight shift at Nellis Air Force Base. He came home in the early hours and went straight to sleep. Stephanie moved through that apartment without a sound, packed her bag, pulled on her clothes, checked the door behind her. She left a sleeping father behind. Outside, the morning air was dry and thin. She turned toward El Dorado High School and started walking the route she had taken dozens of times before. At Stewart Avenue and Lynn Lane, she reached the shortcut, a vacant sandlot opening into open desert, dry brush lining, both sides, fine sand that shifted quietly underfoot. She stepped in. The desert was completely silent. She never came out the other side. Her father slept on, unaware. Across town, her friends were arriving at school, saving a spot in Jensen's classroom, wondering where she was. And somewhere in that sandlot, the worst thing that can happen to a family had already happened. The only question now was how long it would take for the world to find out. Her father would wake up that afternoon to a phone call that would stop his heart. What happened next? The desperate search, the thing they found in that desert, that is where this story goes now. That morning, El Dorado High School filled up the way it always did. Lockers slamming, sneakers on linoleum, the low noise of 1,000 teenagers starting another ordinary Tuesday. Stephanie was not there. The school registered her absence, marked it down, and then did nothing. No phone call to her father, no follow-up. They assumed what schools always assume: illness, a family matter, something normal. So the day moved forward without her. But in Jocelyn Jensen's classroom, at lunch, something felt wrong. The little team gathered in their usual corner. Same chairs, same table, same routine. Except one seat was empty, Stephanie's seat, and she was never absent. Not like this, not without a word to anyone. Jensen noticed. Her friends noticed. But there was no explanation, just an empty chair that made the room feel different. The afternoon passed. School ended. Stephanie did not come home. John Isaacson woke up that afternoon the way he always did after a night shift, slowly, the world coming back to him in pieces. He had no reason to think anything was wrong. Stephanie was responsible. She had been doing this routine for months, getting herself up, getting herself to school, handling her own day. Then his girlfriend called. Stephanie had not come home. He told himself it was nothing. He probably stopped somewhere with friends. Teenagers do that. He waited. The minutes moved. She still did not come home. He called the school. The person on the other end checked the records and told him what they had failed to tell him hours earlier. Stephanie had not been at school. Not first period, not lunch, not at all. She was never there. The bottom fell out of everything. He called her friends one by one. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. Nobody knew where she was. Each call that came back empty was another door closing. He called the police. He filed the report. And then, because John Isaacson was not the kind of man who sat and waited, he drove to the stables at Nellis Air Force Base. He called his friend Gary Braley. He called others. Within the hour, a small group of men on horseback moved out into the desert, stretching between Stephanie's apartment and her school. Las Vegas in June. Even after sundown, the heat stays in the ground. The sky was turning dark at the edges, and the desert floor was still warm underfoot. Their horses moved through the brush at a steady pace, kicking up fine dust that hung in the dry air behind them. They were covering the path she would have walked. Every shortcut, every gap between the buildings, every patch of open ground between Nellis Boulevard and El Dorado High School. They called her name. The desert did not answer. Then Gary Braley slowed his horse. Something on the ground had caught his eye. He looked down. Then he looked at John. Are those hers? John Isaacson looked at what was scattered across the sand and felt something move through him that had no name. They were schoolbooks, spread across the ground, not in a line, not the way someone dropped something by accident, but scattered, thrown, or dropped mid-motion, the way things fall when a person does not get to decide how they fall, and in the sand around them, something else, a trail. Not straight, not the path of someone walking, a zigzag, a drag pattern cutting through the dirt and brush, moving away from the open ground and into the thicker vegetation off to the side. Something had happened here, something sudden and violent and fast. John called the police again. His voice was different this time. What followed was the kind of search that tells you everyone already knows this is serious. Helicopters swept low over the desert, their lights cutting across the scrub and sand. 9 units were brought in. Dogs working the ground in the darkness, pulling toward every scent that did not belong. Ground teams fanned out on foot, moving in lines through the brush. The desert around Stewart Avenue and Nellis Boulevard had been a mostly undeveloped stretch of land at that time. Thick patches of dry brush, deep shadows, the kind of terrain where you could be 20 feet from something and never see it. The search went on for hours. The city moved around them, lights and noise and the ordinary business of a Tuesday night in Las Vegas, while out in that desert, flashlight beams swept back and forth through the darkness and nobody said what everyone was thinking. Then, just before 11 o'clock at night, one of the K9 units broke away from the search line. The dog pulled hard to the left, away from the path, nose down, moving fast toward a dense patch of brush sitting about 25 yards off the trail. The handler followed. The other officers moved in behind them, and there, half hidden in the brush, was something that should not have been there. An old piece of orange carpet, laid over something, covering something. The dog stopped. The desert went completely silent. And every officer standing in that darkness understood in the same instant what they were about to find. What was underneath that carpet? What had been done to a 14-year-old girl on her way to school? The details that came out at autopsy are the kind that stay with investigators for the rest of their careers. That is where this story goes next. They lifted the orange carpet, and then nobody spoke. That is what happens in moments like that. The training, the procedure, the years on the job, all of it goes quiet for just a second, because what was underneath that carpet was a 14-year-old girl who had left for school that morning. Stephanie Isaacson, brown hair, still wearing the clothes she had put on before sunrise. The investigators did what they were trained to do. They documented, they photographed. They moved carefully through that patch of desert brush, bagging evidence, marking positions, working the scene with the kind of focused silence that comes from understanding that this ground, right here, is the only witness they have. The autopsy confirmed she had been the victim of a fatal physical attack. The medical examiner determined she had not survived the encounter for long. It was fast and it was brutal, and she had been left there covered by a piece of discarded orange carpet like she was something to be hidden. The scene was a nightmare for any investigator. It was clear she'd been the victim of a sudden and violent struggle before her life was taken, and her shoes were gone. Not misplaced, not lost in the brush, gone. Her shoes were never found. Not that day, not in any search that followed. Investigators noted it and moved on. But that detail lodged itself somewhere. A killer who takes something from a victim and keeps it. That is not accident, that is intention. Something about Stephanie's shoes mattered to whoever did this. And that thought, quiet and cold, would sit at the back of this case for decades. That same night, John Isaacson went home. The apartment was the same as he had left it that morning. Her things were still there. The life they had built together in that small space, still there. He picked up the phone, not to call the police, not to call family. He called a radio station. He asked them to play a song. Bette Midler, Wind Beneath My Wings. It was Stephanie's favorite. A father sitting alone in a quiet apartment, listening to his daughter's song play out over the Las Vegas airwaves. No audience, no ceremony, just a man saying goodbye the only way he had left. 2 memorials followed. One in Las Vegas for her friends, her little team, the people who had known her and the life she had built there. Then her body was taken back to Lincoln, Nebraska, where she was buried at Lincoln Memorial Park, back in the city where she was born, in the ground that had known her family longest. The city of bright lights held its breath for a moment. Then it moved on. Stephanie did not get to move on. The investigation started with almost nothing and slowly became less than that. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the sandlot that morning, but nobody could agree on what it looked like. Color unknown, make unknown, model unknown. A car that might have been there, described 5 different ways by 5 different people, amounting to exactly nothing a detective could use. Vagrants had been known to pass through that stretch of undeveloped land near Stewart Avenue. That was followed up. It led nowhere. 2 months after the murder, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit produced a profile of the killer. He was likely in his early 20s. He probably lived or worked close to the crime scene. He was possibly a loner. His behavior had likely changed noticeably after the attack. He had likely experienced a conflict with a woman in his life shortly before the killing. That profile was more accurate than anyone knew at the time. Every single detail would one day point directly at a man investigators had never once considered a suspect. But in 1989, the profile was just paper. And paper does not make an arrest. Detectives worked the case for years. They traveled to Washington State following a lead, then Ohio, then Texas. Each trip built on something, a tip, a name, a connection, and each trip ended the same way. Wrong person, dead end, back to square one. In 1998, 9 years after the murder, forensic science had advanced enough to attempt DNA testing on the evidence collected from the crime scene. The samples were tested. Nothing usable came back. In 2007, they tried again. This time, a cold case team using more advanced technology was able to identify actual DNA. A forensic sample recovered from Stephanie's shirt. It was real. It was from her killer. They entered it into CODIS, the National DNA Database, and waited for a match. No match. The DNA existed. The killer's genetic fingerprint was sitting in a database. And somewhere out there, the man who left it was living his life, whatever was left of it, completely untouched. The case file stayed open. The years kept moving. Las Vegas grew into a different city around the place where she died. The sandlot changed. The neighborhood changed. The world moved forward in the way the world always does, indifferent to the cases it leaves unresolved. Retired Metro Deputy Chief Mike Hawkins, who had worked the original investigation, said it plainly before he left the department. "What bothers me the most is I know there is someone out there who got away with murder. I think about Stephanie Isaacson." He retired. The case sat. 32 years of silence. 32 years of dust settling over a file that never officially closed, but never moved either. Until a man in Henderson, Nevada, picked up the phone. His name was Justin Wu. He had no badge, no training, no jurisdiction. What he had was $5,000 and a question. Could the newest science in the world do what 3 decades of detective work could not? That question, and the answer it produced, is where this story goes next. Justin Wu was not a detective. He carried no badge. He had no jurisdiction. He had never worked a crime scene in his life. He was an entrepreneur who had moved to Henderson, Nevada from Los Angeles, and somewhere along the way he had decided that living in a place meant owing something to it. He had already started a nonprofit called Vegas Helps, not a charity in the distant, abstract sense, but a hands-on operation. Groceries delivered to families who needed them, a car for someone who had no other way to get to work, direct help for real people in the city he had chosen as home. Then he heard about a laboratory in Texas that was doing something extraordinary with DNA. He reached out to Othram Labs. He told them he wanted to fund a cold case. He was prepared to cover the full cost himself. But he had one condition. It has to be a Las Vegas case, not a famous case. Not a case with media attention. Just someone from his city who had been waiting too long for an answer. Othram contacted the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The department looked at their cold case files and made a choice. They brought forward the name of a 14-year-old girl who had been murdered on her way to school 31 years earlier, Stephanie Isaacson. On the other side of that decision was Detective Terry Miller. He had been assigned to Stephanie's case in 2018 and had spent 3 years building something that most cold case investigators rarely get the chance to build, a relationship with the victim's family. Every 6 months she called John Isaacson, not because there was news. There was almost never news. She called because she wanted him to know that someone was still there, that the file had not been forgotten, that his daughter still had someone in her corner. 3 years of calls, 3 years of the same quiet answer, "We are still working on it." When the Othram opportunity came through, Miller did not hesitate. But she also understood exactly what it meant. The DNA evidence from Stephanie's case had been tested twice, in 1998 and again in 2007. Both times it had come back with nothing usable. What was left after 3 decades of testing and degradation was almost nothing. She said it plainly. We were at the wall. This was our last shot. In January 2021, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department submitted the last remaining DNA evidence from Stephanie's case to Othram Labs. The amount they sent was 0.12 nanograms. That number means nothing until you hold it next to something familiar. When you send a DNA sample to a consumer service like Ancestry or 23andMe, the minimum they need to run their test is 750 nanograms. That is a standard, everyday sample. That is what a functioning DNA test requires. What Miller sent to Othram was not 750 nanograms. It was not even close to 750 nanograms. It was the equivalent of 15 human cells. Imagine the last grain of sand at the bottom of an hourglass. Imagine the last drop of water in a glass that has been sitting in the desert sun for 30 years. That is what they had. One submission, one attempt. If the process failed, or if the sample was consumed without producing a result, there would be nothing left, no second chance. No future technology to try again. The evidence would simply be gone. That was the weight sitting on this moment. Othram Labs, based outside Houston, Texas, was built specifically for cases like this. Their process, forensic-grade genome sequencing, is designed to extract genetic information from samples that every other method has already failed on. They do not work with clean, abundant DNA. They work with what is left when everything else has been taken by time. What their scientists did with Stephanie's 15 cells was build a genetic profile of her killer. Not a name, not yet, a map. A biological blueprint pointing toward a family somewhere in the population. Then the genealogists went to work. And this is where the trail became a maze. The profile revealed French-Canadian ancestry, but not from one place or one generation. There were roots from French-Canadian communities in New England and separate, more recent French-Canadian descent from Canada itself. 2 different branches, 2 different timelines, crossing somewhere in the family tree of a man nobody had identified yet. The genealogists built outward from that intersection, constructing branches, testing connections, eliminating dead ends. 7 months of work. The kind of painstaking, methodical research that looks nothing like what you see in a television drama. Just researchers at computers, moving through records and family trees, one name at a time. Outside, the world moved through 2021. John Isaacson, living in South Dakota now, waited. Justin Wu waited, told nothing about which case had been selected or where the investigation stood. Detective Miller waited. The genealogy team narrowed the pool to 2 possible suspects, then they narrowed it to 1. On July 12, 2021, Othram Labs called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. They had a name. Miller received that call after 3 years of 6-month check-ins with a grieving father, after 2 prior DNA failures, after an investigation that had traveled to 3 states and come back empty every single time. The name Othram gave her did not come from nowhere. It came from a family tree, built from 15 cells, built from the last evidence that existed in a case that had been cold for 32 years. And when the detectives looked at that name, when they pulled up the record attached to it, the room went quiet in a different way than it had in that desert sandlot in 1989. Because this man had been suspected of murder before, he had stood in front of the justice system, and he had walked free. Who he was, what he had done before Stephanie, and what the full picture of his life revealed about the system that let him keep going. That is what this story uncovers next. His name was Darren Roy Marchand. He was a Las Vegas man. He lived there. He worked there. He walked the same streets, breathed the same desert air, existed inside the same city as the families he destroyed. For 32 years, nobody connected his name to Stephanie Isaacson. He was invisible in plain sight. But his story did not begin with Stephanie. It began 3 years earlier. February 27, 1986. A woman named Nanette Vandenberg was found in her apartment on East Tropicana Avenue. She was 24 years old. She was found in her bathtub, and like Stephanie, she had been the victim of a fatal assault. Investigators traced her last known movements to the Nevada Palace Casino. She had been there that night, and she had been there with Darren Marchand. He was 20 years old. When detectives came for him, they found his fingerprints near her body. They had a witness placing him with her hours before her death. They charged him with her murder. And then the case fell apart. 2 days of testimony. A judge who ruled the fingerprint evidence insufficient to move forward. The charge was dismissed. Darren Marchand walked out of that courtroom a free man. Nanette Vandenberg's family got nothing. Now hold that thought, because what happens next is the part that is almost impossible to sit with. Less than a year after Nanette's murder, Marchand got married. By early 1989, he had a toddler daughter at home and a wife who was pregnant with their son. In January of that same year, 1989, he was charged with 5 counts of predatory and indecent behavior. 5 separate incidents where he targeted women in public. He pleaded guilty to 1 count. The other 4 were dropped. On August 29, 1989, he was sentenced to a maximum of 1 year of probation. But that sentencing date, August 29th, matters more than it might seem. Because Stephanie Isaacson was murdered on June 1, 1989, Darren Marchand killed a 14-year-old girl on her way to school while he was waiting to be sentenced for a separate crime. He went home that morning to a pregnant wife and a toddler daughter. He sat in that house. He waited for his court date. He served his probation. And nobody knew what he had done in that sandlot. The FBI profile from 1989 said the killer was likely in his early 20s, probably lived or worked near the crime scene, had likely experienced a recent conflict with a woman in his life, and may have been a loner whose behavior changed after the killing. Darren Marchand was 24 years old in 1989. He lived minutes from that sandlot. He had an active criminal case involving women at the time of the murder. The profile was a perfect outline of him, drawn in 1989, matched in 2021, 32 years apart. Marchand and his wife divorced in 1990. Records show he had at least 1 other child from a separate relationship. Whatever his life looked like from the outside, whatever ordinary shape it took, inside it, he carried what he had done to Nanette Vandenberg in 1986. Carried what he had done to Stephanie Isaacson in 1989. In 1995, weeks before his 30th birthday, Darren Roy Marchand died by suicide in Las Vegas. He was 29 years old. Do not call that justice. It was not justice. It was an exit. A door he closed on his own terms, taking every answer with him. Why he did it, whether there were others, what he felt in the years between. John Isaacson never got to sit across from him, never got to ask him why, never got to look him in the eye in a courtroom and watch a verdict come down. That is what John meant. That son of a bitch got me twice, once when he killed my daughter, and the other one when I didn't get the opportunity to look him in the eye. The first time Marchand took something from that family, he took Stephanie. The second time, he took the one thing that might have offered even a fraction of closure, accountability. A reckoning, a moment where the truth had consequences. He denied them both. On July 21, 2021, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department held a press conference. 32 years after a 14-year-old girl walked into a sandlot and never came out, they had a name. Lieutenant Ray Spencer stood at that podium and read a statement from Stephanie's mother. "I'm glad they found who murdered my daughter. I never believed the case would be solved." It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us. Detective Dan Long, who had worked the case alongside Terry Miller, said what every investigator on this case felt about the man responsible. I'd like to think he committed suicide because of the things he was doing, and Ultram CEO David Middleman said something that reached beyond this one case. Eventually, this technology will drive repeat crime to extinction. 15 cells, a world record, 32 years, one name. On September 21, 2021, John Isaacson stood inside the Clark County Commission chambers. Across from him was Justin Wu, the man who had written a check for $5,000 and asked only that it help someone from his city. The two men shook hands. No words recorded from that moment have survived in the public record, but the photograph exists. A father, a stranger who cared enough to act, and between them the invisible weight of everything that had finally, after 3 decades, been put to rest. In 2024, Justin Wu received the key to the Las Vegas Strip, one of the highest honors Clark County can give, for the work his Vegas Justice League had done in cracking cold cases across southern Nevada. Stephanie's case was where it all began. She was 14 years old. She was 6 weeks from Spain. She was the girl who stayed home from the mall because her little sister could not come. She was the voice in the choir, the center of the little team, the daughter who chose her father when the world asked her to choose. She walked into a sandlot on a warm June morning and the desert took her, but it could not keep her forever. 15 cells, that is all that was left. 15 cells carried 32 years of silence, and when the right people finally listened, when science finally caught up to what had been done to her, those 15 cells said her name loud enough for the whole world to hear. Stephanie Ann Isaacson. She was never just a case file. And she never will be. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and leave a thought in the comments. This family carried this weight for 32 years, and the least we can do is make sure her name is remembered. And before you go, 3 questions worth thinking about. If Marchand had been convicted in 1986 for Nanette Vandenberg's murder, Stephanie would almost certainly be alive today. Does the justice system bear responsibility for what happened to her? Justin Wu was an ordinary citizen with no law enforcement background, just a man who decided to act. How many cold cases do you think are sitting right now, waiting for someone like him to step forward? Stephanie's DNA evidence was almost completely gone, 15 cells away from disappearing forever. How many cases do you think have already gone cold permanently because no one moved fast enough?